here's something strange. In the spring of 2025, a routine trade advisory meeting at the Office of the United States Trade Representative was quietly canceled. No rescheduling notice, no explanation in the Federal Register. The officials who were supposed to attend, career economists, some with decades of institutional memory, were told their input was no longer needed for that particular decision. The decision had already been made somewhere else, by someone else. And the paperwork, when it finally surfaced weeks later through a Freedom of Information request filed by a small policy journal, had been backdated. That is a small thing on its face. Administrative reshuffling happens. Calendars get cleared. But here is the part worth sitting with. It wasn't the only meeting that disappeared that month. It was the fourth. Notice something. When the first term of Donald Trump's presidency made controversial decisions, there was almost always a paper trail, chaotic, sometimes contradictory, occasionally leaked in real time. Advisors talked, staffers resigned and wrote books. The machinery of leakage, however imperfect, still functioned. What is different about this second term, and this is the thread worth pulling, is the silence. Not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of something happening very deliberately out of view. Consider who is not in the room anymore. The second-term cabinet is notably lean on the kinds of officials who once served as internal friction, the Rex Tillersons, the Jim Matthises, the figures who would occasionally slow walk an order or quietly flag a concern to a congressional staffer. In their place are loyalists with thin institutional footprints, executives and political figures whose professional survival is tied directly to the continuation of this administration. That is not an accident of personnel. That is a structural choice, and structural choices have consequences. The backstory requires a brief detour because the architecture of what we're seeing now was actually designed in plain sight. Beginning in late 2023, a network of conservative legal and policy organizations, some well-known, some operating under recently registered LLCs, began drafting what became a governing blueprint for executive consolidation. The publicly visible version of this effort was Project 2025, which received enormous press attention. But the public document was, according to several people who worked adjacent to the process, the version meant to be seen. The working annexes the operational specifics on agency staffing, regulatory rollback sequencing, and what one participant described to a policy researcher as decision insulation protocols were never published. They didn't need to be. They just needed to be implemented. Here is what we know from the paper trail that does exist. Since January 2025, more than 60 significant regulatory and executive decisions across energy, finance, immigration enforcement, and defense procurement have been issued through mechanisms that bypass the standard notice and comment process. Some were issued as emergency determinations. Some came bundled inside broader executive orders where the specific operational clauses were embedded in subsections that received little press coverage. Others were executed through agency guidance documents, which carry enforcement weight but don't require congressional review. Lawyers who track administrative law for a living have described the pattern in published legal reviews as systematic structural insulation, meaning the decision. Ions are being made in ways specifically chosen to reduce the number of choke points where outside scrutiny could intervene. Walk through a few specifics. In February, an executive action restructuring oversight authority within the Department of Energy was signed on a Friday afternoon, a timing pattern that anyone who covers Washington recognizes. The restructuring shifted final sign-off authority on certain long-term infrastructure, contracts away from career staff and toward a newly created political appointee office. The contracts in question involve energy grid projects in 6 swing states. In March, a guidance update from the Department of Labor quietly narrowed the classification criteria for a category of workers in the gig economy, not through a formal rulemaking, which would have required public comment, but through an internal memo designated as interpretive guidance. The practical effect on approximately 4 million workers took effect without a single congressional hearing. In April, a defense procurement decision was processed through a little-used emergency authorization channel. allocating a contract to a firm whose primary investor group has documented financial ties to individuals who bundled major contributions to the 2024 campaign. The contract amount classified, the justification, national security. The oversight mechanism, none that is currently publicly accessible. Each of these in isolation is arguably defensible. Governments make procurement decisions. Agencies issue guidance. Administrators reorganize offices. But here is the moment where the picture resolves. What connects these decisions, the canceled advisory meetings, the Friday afternoon signings, the guidance documents, the emergency authorizations, is not their subject matter. It is their architecture. They were each structured specifically to minimize the window in which outside review, judicial challenge, or press scrutiny could intervene before implementation. That is not a coincidence pattern. That is a methodology. And here is the part that should concern all of us, regardless of where you sit politically. Democratic governance, not the party. The system functions on the premise that decisions of national consequence move through processes that allow for some form of accountability. Public comment, congressional review, judicial oversight, or at minimum, a PRE. SS Core with enough access to ask questions before the ink dries. What is being constructed here, methodically and with evident legal preparation, is a decision-making infrastructure that runs alongside those processes rather than through them. The decisions are legal. Many of them are within the technical authority of the executive branch, but legality and accountability are not the same thing, and one can be preserved while the other is quietly, structurally hollowed out. The strategic consequences extend beyond domestic policy. Several of the decisions made through these insulated channels in the first quarter of 2025 have affected America's posture with NATO partners, trade relationships with Pacific allies, and the terms under which U.S. intelligence sharing agreements are being quietly renegotiated. Foreign governments are noticing. Diplomatic cables obtained by European journalists and reported on by several outlets describe a pattern of commitments made at the official level and then modified or reversed through channels that official counterparts cannot trace. One senior European diplomat, speaking anonymously to a Belgian policy publication, described the experience as negotiating with an institution that has learned to make its decisions disappear. Two things remain unresolved and worth watching. First, the legal architecture sustaining these mechanisms has not yet been fully tested in federal court. Several challenges are in early stages, but the administration has been strategic about which decisions to defend aggressively and which to quietly modify before a ruling is issued, a pattern that makes it difficult to establish the precedent that would constrain future use. Second, there is a question of what happens to the institutional memory being systematically removed from these agencies. Career officials carry in their heads the context, the history, the informal norms that govern how power is actually exercised day to day. When they are replaced or sidelined, that knowledge doesn't transfer. It disappears. And what fills the vacuum, who fills it, and under what accountability structure is a question that, as of today, has no public answer. The decisions aren't secret because they're hidden. They're secret because the system built to surface them has been, piece by piece, redesigned to look the other way.